3. I had thought this quest would be a pain in the ass, but I was wrong. It was more than just a pain in the ass. It was indescribably monumental, unprecedented pain in the ass. That was the only way to classify our first quest on the 4th floor, the Shipwright of Yore. Listen, we can't take this thing with us in any other floor, so what's the harm in a little bit of compromise? I pleaded, but Asuna would have none of it. No, if he's gonna make us a ship, it's gonna be the best it can possibly be. Fine. By the way, the word ship is a bit ostentatious for what we're getting. A gondola is really more of a boat. Fine, it'll be the best boat it can possibly be. We were making our way through the forest at night. Unlike the dry, desolate tinder of the Beta, the large forest was to the southeast of Rovia was now brimming with life. The way the branches and leaves practically blotted out of the sky was very similar to the forest of the 3rd floor. But the ground underfoot was much different. The thick, wet moss swallowed the soles of our boots with every step, making traversal quite difficult. On top of that, the little spring where everywhere, and I'd already stepped into the deep water 4 times on our 3 hours of searching. The reason I wasn't paying attention to my footing was because we were looking up above as we traveled. Asuna was doing the same, but I never saw her step in the water or trip on any tree roots. Had to be the high resistance value to be stumbling, or an excellent real-life luck stat. If it was the latter, we ought to be finding our target by now. I thought resentfully. We were not on the hunt for delectable fruits or nuts or bees' nests full of honey. We were looking for 4-pronged claw marks on the tree trunks, territorial markings of the gray bear that ruled over this forest. We'd already defeated over 10 normal-sized black bears since entering the woods. It was bear fat that the old shipwright demanded from us, so the quest would obviously proceed perfectly fine with the fat of those ordinary black bears dropped. In that sense, the amount of trouble this quest represented was determined by the player, him or herself. And Asuna was dead set on the fat of the King of the Woods, whose existence the old man had briefly hinted at. It was highly likely that the quality of the item we brought back would have an effect on the quality of the boat. Still, I'm a bit surprised. I didn't think you would feel so strong about this thing, Asuna, I said, scanning for claw marks by the light of the moon. Her response came from the right. What sort of thing? Oh, this sort of scenario happens a lot in RPGs. You don't have to get the best possible results in order to beat the challenge, but if the player wants to, she can strive for it. I guess it's a completionist thing? Well, I don't like the way it sounds like when I'm being taken advantage of, but I wasn't thinking about any game mechanics or design. I just thought my old man might be a gruff and unfriendly, but he probably really wants to make one perfect boat. I see. At that point, there were no use demanding compromise from her. Just over 3 hours ago, we'd successfully turned in the exclamation mark over the old NPC's head into a question mark. He exhaled a long pull of the smoke from his pipe.
I'm not a shipwright anymore. Water Carriers Guild controls all the materials of shipwright needs to build boats. But if you still want one, first go to the forest at the southeast and get the bear fat to seal the wood against the water. But if you run into cross the Bear King, best run, save your own hide. I'm sure his fat would be best of all.
There was plenty in that opening speech to be curious about, but the old man closed his eyes and showed no interest in elaboration. So we left the house, hailed another gondola on the move, then left the town via the south gate en route to our current location. The King of the Bears did exist in the beta, and I did track down his claw marks back then, but I never ran across it in the end. From what I heard, there were a number of full 6-member parties who were scattered by the bear's wrath. It was nerve-wracking to be tracking down such a deadly foe with only the two of us, but we were already far higher level than I'd been at this point in the beta. And the bear was a bear. It wasn't going to be blowing fire or venom at us and had no sword skills. The attack patterns wouldn't be much different from a normal bear. Hopefully. But it would be best if Asuna gave up on this crazy idea. I was getting hungry again. And after a few hundreds of times looking up at trees, my mind vacillating between optimism and pessimism, I finally saw a clear pattern of 4 deep horizontal grooves. I looked ahead at Asuna's back, and after a brief moment of hesitation, I made up my mind and called out to her. "Hey, I found it!" "What? Really?" She raced back instantly and looked up at the spot where I pointed, her face bright with expectation. "You're right. So if we just wait next to the tree, the bear will eventually pop nearby?" "Supposedly." "Let's take a break here then. We'll need to check our potions." Her high-speed chatter slowed to a halt, so I looked over to see what was the matter. Her slender eyebrows were knitted in concern as she stared at the fresh markings. When she spoke again, her voice was 30% quieter. Kirito, those marks are a whole lot higher on the tree than I was expecting." "Huh?" I looked back at the claw marks and calculating their height from the ground. 7, 15, 20, 25 feet tall? What kind of bear scratches at a tree that height? Well, it would have to be a bear that stands 25 feet tall. That doesn't sound like a bear anymore. As our conversation got quieter and quieter, a heavy thud behind us shook the forest. I slowly turned around, terrified of what I might find, to see the shadow of a small mountain just inches away. Each gray hair was thick as a needle. The red eyes gleamed in the dark. Fierce fangs poked from its mouth. Claws like daggers protruded from limbs as burly logs. And on its forehead, a black, sharp, gleaming horns. "Yup, that's not a bear. It has horns," I muttered. Above the head of the creature that looked like a bear, but was not a bear, a deep crimson red cursor appeared with the name Magnetherium. The growl it uttered was nothing at all like a bear's. It shuffled and stood up vertically. The beast's trunk, which seemed to extend forever, blocking out by the moonlight, enshrouded us in darkness. Those gleaming eyes at the very top of its black shadow did indeed seem to be at least 25 feet tall. "Stay calm, Asuna," I whispered frantically. "It can't be that agile with a size this big. Keep a tree between you, and at all times it can't charge you." This order came from the knowledge that the black bears we'd been fighting until now had liked to perform direct charge attacks. My partner nodded to me as we drew our blades. Asuna's chivalric rapier +5 and my Neil blade +8 began to glow faintly. The Magnetherium growled again in response to the light and opened its massive jaws. Asuna and I both hopped backwards and retreated behind a large tree. If the Magnetherium charged headfirst into the trunk, that should stun it for a brief moment. Then we could each hit it with a single skill and gauge how much damage that caused. Within a single second, my idea was shot to pieces. Red light flickered deep within the Magnetherium's throat. It was a beautiful but deadly effect that I had seen on far higher floors in the beta, but for the first time since we'd been trapped in this game of death. The pre-effect for fire breath. I immediately abandoned the option of hiding behind the shelter of the tree trunk. Unlike the lightning breath of Astros, the Taurus King on the second floor, fire could make its way through obstacles to an extent. Even if the tree itself stood against all the blaze, we could easily be charred to a crisp behind it. Perhaps a sideways dash then. But then the Magnetherium's red eyes followed us perfectly. If we ran to the side, it could simply charge the direction of its blast. There must be a more reliable method of evasion. This way! Suddenly, a burst of inspiration. I grabbed Asana's slender body with my left arm and jumped directly backward. 1, 2, 3 steps, and I was at the right spot. It was one of the little natural springs, small but deep, that had plagued me during our search. At the same moment that I jumped into the water without hesitation, orange flames burst from the Magnetherium's jaw. Just as my entire body was engulfed in chilly water, the surface of water turned red. I pushed Asana down to the bottom of the spring and tried to shrink down as much as I could. The flames licked and howled for close to 5 seconds, bringing the near-freezing spring water to lukewarm. For a moment, I was afraid it might eventually reach boiling temperatures, but the breath finally abated right as it reached the point of a hot bath. As soon as the surface above us went dark, we leapt out. As soon as she stepped onto solid ground, her long hair and cape of hem dripping profusely, Asana muttered, "That is definitely not a bear." "Definitely not," I agreed, scanning the surroundings. The Magnetherium hadn't moved spots, but the terrain in front of it was blackened and smoking. The tree I'd thought to use as cover was still standing, but it was charred and ashen now. As I feared, the flames had covered the backside. "What do you think? Should we run?" I asked, recognizing that a very dangerous challenge with such a deadly foe without any preparation or forehand knowledge. But Asana didn't bite immediately. "We don't have to force ourselves to fight it, but I at least want to collect a bit more intel. We should learn more about the bear's attacks so we can beat it next time." I thought fast, watching the Magnetherium closely as it slowly stirred 60 feet away. As long as there was a nearby spring to jump into, we could evade those fire attacks without damage, and it was probably didn't have any other special attacks to watch out for. Its physical attacks were no doubt quite dangerous based on the knife-like claws, but we could shield ourselves against the trees for those. "All right, let's start retreating back for town and take some good data." "Deal." Meanwhile, the Magnetherium began advancing. It started off as a gentle 4-legged ambling, but then, as though a switch had been flipped, it began to charge. The sight of that imposing figure, over 12 feet tall at the shoulder, about the size of a bulbous bough from the second floor, racing along and pounding the earth, was nothing short of sheer terror. Not only does it have its own name, I'm starting to think it's actually a field boss. "At the very least, it's definitely not a bear," Asana hissed as we ran. We circled around to the right of the Magnetherium, hoping to evade its path with charred, but it simply turned and followed. We weren't just running blindly, though. Once we'd maneuvered to a large old oak stood between us, and we held position. "Come on, do your worst!" If it charged headfirst into the 6-foot wide tree, that should at least stop it for several seconds. But 2 seconds later, my bracing challenge turned into shock. "No way!" As I expected, the Magnetherium charged straight for us and collided with the tree at maximum speed. But like some horrid giant's hammer, the thick, short horns of its forehead crushed the wide trunk into tiny splinters. Thankfully, it did stop the charge short, but the demon bear wasn't stunned. It roared powerfully on the side of the tilting tree. My ears ringing with the tremendous volume of its bellowing, I whispered to Asana, "Hey, what are the bear's natural enemies?" "First of all, it's not a bear, but in real life, the larger bears have no enemies. They might be brought down by a tiger or a killer whale every once in a while, though." "Well, that's just great. Any weaknesses?" "Why are you asking me? I think I read in a book once that their snouts are sensitive." "The snout," I repeated, staring hard at the Magnetherium as it began to move again. The beast's forehead was protected by those hardy thorns, but its black snout was defenseless. On the other hand, even on all fours, it was at least 10 feet off the ground, so I couldn't even hit it with my sword. I might be able to hit it with a jumping type sword skill, but if it reacted to my attack and stood up, we were screwed. What if I could give you a good magic spell with some ice magic and physical effects, slamming down giant icicles or something? At least I'd be able to crit him a few times. How about rather than imagining things that will never happen, you decide what we should do? Asuna demanded, shattering my fragile hopes and dreams. Somehow she had opened her window to the map screen and set to the visible party members. So I leaned in for a look. We were currently smack in the center of the woods to the southeast of Rovia. There were sheer cliffs to the north and east, beyond which were usual river. The map was grayed out, but in my memory from the beta served, there were cliffs to the south as well. There was a good 50 yards distance from the forest to the surface of the water, so even if there was river below, it didn't know if it could survive the fall. In other words, jumping out of the river to escape wasn't an option. We had to leave the forest to the west and escape the safe haven of Rovia. Hey, Asuna tugged on my sleeve, drawing my glance from the map to her face. Seems like the bear goes immobile for a bit after blowing its fire breath and knocking down trees. I looked at the magnetherium on her suggestion. The giant bear, which had just knocked over a giant tree with its horns alone, was not exactly stunned, but it stood in place, grunting and growling. It would surely attack if we got closer, but Asuna noted after both the breath attack and the tree charge, it had stopped moving for a time. In other words, if we could make use of that habit, it might not be as hard as to escape. That's weakness number 1, if you can even call it a weakness, I mumbled. It was sure useful habit to take advantage of when escaping, but it was no use when trying to defeat the beast, because we were still needed to get closer to attack. Besides, there were only so many major trees with enough bulk to stop the bear. If we stayed in one area, it could eventually knock them all over. At that point, I noticed something odd. It had nothing to do with me, Asuna, and the magnetherium. Over near the creature, the fallen tree trunk was partially there, even though its roots and branches had shattered like glass and disappeared already. It was a game object that fell to the ground and stayed there rather than vanishing. That meant it was an item that could be picked up. Asuna, how much storage space do you still have? I asked, then remembered that she had filled her capacity with small articles of underwear. But Asuna seemed to understand exactly what I was thinking about. I've got enough space. Remember when I told you I'd returned most of the clothes I sewed to train tailoring skill back to cloth? Yes, of course. Well, if you don't mind, when I lead the bear away, can you go pick up the log at its feet and check the item name, whether or not you have enough room for it? There was suspicion in her eyes, but Asuna didn't argue. Sure. At that exact moment, the magnetheriums burst into life again. About 50 seconds had passed since it crashed into the tree. I recalled a pause around 25 seconds after its use of fire breath, which certainly left enough time for us to use escape if it made use of it. I patted her on the left arm in a show of support and darted out to the undergrowth we'd been using as cover. Over here, you overgrown teddy! I shouted, running around to the right side of the monster. The magnetherium spun with agility that belied its massive bulk and stomped after me, rumbling the ground with every step. When not using its special charge attack, the monster was just a bit slower than me. The problem was the treacherous terrain of the damp moss and tangled roots that threatened to slip or trip at any moment. I guided the bear north, paying as much attention as I possibly could to the ground before me. Once I knew I was at least 30 yards away from Asuna, I stopped and turned around. I didn't expect to beat the creature on my first attempt, but I at least wanted to get a sense of how to fight it. I clutched my nail blade and waited for the bear to descend on me. It roared, utterly non-mammalian. The magnetherium's front right arm swung up high, the limb thicker than a human body. The claws gleamed hungrily as they caught the pale moonlight. As the paw came roaring down at me, I shot back the sword, skill slant. The thick blade, glowing light blue, clashed with the four claws midair. A tremendous shockwave ran through my avatar's arm, shoulders, hips, and legs. I was knocked by the powerful collision, and my back smashed against a tree, but I was still standing. The Magnetherium would not have been knocked over, of course, but its front paw was still floating in the air from the momentum of my strike, so at the very least, I could use my sword skill to deflect an ordinary attack. On the other hand, given that my Anneal Blade Plus 8 had 4 extra points to sharpen and 4 to its durability, a lesser blade would probably not stand up to the shock. I checked my feet and glanced at both HP gauges. The enemy was unharmed, of course. I'd taken a bit of damage from slamming into the tree behind me, but it was nothing serious. Now it's my turn, I growled and stepped forward. The Magnetherium's eyes flashed red, though it couldn't have recognized my challenge. It snorted and pulled both of my front legs off the ground, slowly standing to an erect position. I sensed that more fire breath was coming, and I looked behind me. There was a small blue water surface gleaming in the back of the grove. If I jumped into it, I could evade the fire breath like last time, but fear rooted my feet to the spot. The massive, 20-plus foot gray monster sucked in a wheezing breath, like bellows, and opened its jaws wide. In that instant, I darted forward rather than back. I knew it couldn't follow flanking maneuvers without a problem, but I hadn't tested its backside yet. Once it was halfway to bear, I sensed the red light above. I kept running at full speed, evading the breath as it bore down with another ear-splitting roar. When the flames hit the ground just behind me, they created a burning tailwind that buffeted my back. "Yow!" I wailed, but made good use of the extra boost to close the last few yards and burst right through the Magnetherium's tree trunk-sized legs. Once I was behind the bear, I hit the brakes and spun around. I was hoping the bear didn't turn around, but stayed forward, blowing its fire breath. This is my chance. I pulled back my thrust and sword and set on my target, aiming right for its barrel-sized, but still short like a bear-like tail. I readied the thrusting sword skill, Sonic Leap. Glowing yellow-green in the darkness, I let the game system automatic assistance propel me forward until my sword met the bear's tail about 10 feet off the ground. There was satisfying resistance to the blow. The bear's massive bulk arched and the fire attack abruptly stopped, leaving little traces of the flame that fell through the air to the ground. As I did backflip and landed, the beast let out a high-pitched squeal. It lowered its paws to the ground and began to run straight ahead. Once it had taken a considerable distance, it finally turned to look back. There was red, burning rage in its eyes now. While it wasn't the snout, the tail seemed to be a critical point of its own. I checked on the Magnetherium's cursor as it retreated, and I noticed that the HP bar was lowered. Not much, but enough. Nice! I pumped my fist at the first proper chunk of damage I'd inflicted so far. "No, it's not nice," came a familiar voice from the rear. I spun around to my left and saw my temporary partner with a cold gaze on her face. "You said you were running away. Now I see you're fighting the thing?" No, I'm just collecting info." I started to explain, then remembered what I'd asked her to do moments before. "Oh, right, what about the log?" I picked it up and put it in my inventory. I can probably fit another 5 logs in there. It's called Noblewood Core. I processed that information within seconds. "I'm betting that's another gondola material, just like bear fat." Huh? Listen, you might be tired of me trying to predict these things, but I can tell that this is one of those quests that forces you to visit the same spot several times. We take the bear fat back to the old man. He tells us we need wood necks. There's probably 1 or 2 other ingredients we need to get in these woods on top of that. Meaning, just like the fat, there might be a normal and fancy version of wood? Asuna asked. As usual, she was quick a learner. I bet you can get the normal type of wood by cutting down any old tree with an axe. But I bet the fancy stuff can only be harvested from the trees that are big enough that you need the lumber chop skill to break them down. We'd have no choice but to build up that skill. Asuna really was dead serious on taking every last step to ensure that we got our best possible boat. Oh, but the log I picked up did say noble wood. Does that mean it's actually pretty fancy? Yeah. See, they set up a way for you to get the luxury stuff without needing the lumber skill. You just have to use the overgrown teddy. Right as I said that, the overgrown teddy was recovering from the damage of its hurt tail. It started loping forward on all fours, then lowered its horns for another charge attack. Here it comes. Find a big tree. Over there, Asuna said, pointing out to the southwest while I got distracted watching the bear. She had indeed found a tree that was just as big as the one the bear had pulverized minutes ago, looming black against the night sky. Okay, now we need to get it to charge into the tree. I know. Then I'll pick up the log and you go and guide it towards the next big tree. Got it? Right. Driven in a way that I'd never seen before, Asuna gave most of the orders as we coordinated to eventually cause 12 bear-on-tree collisions. The number of noble wood cores that dropped from each tree was randomly determined between 0 and 3, which was fortuitable with leading a bear around. Both of us had essentially maxed out our storage capacity. I couldn't help but fall back on that old curse. If I'd only chosen the inventory space expansion. I don't know if this will be enough for the shipwright, but we can't carry any more this way anyway. Once we get him sitting again, let's break away and return to town, I whispered to my partner. We still don't have enough fat, though, she pointed out. I grimaced at the sky. Right, crap. And the quest won't advance unless we give him that. And I suppose compromising with normal bear fat is out of the question. Of course, I agreed, crestfallen. I used the Magnatherium's current post-charge sitting state to check on its HP status. I'd taken the time to attack its tail and legs a few times during our careful manipulation, and while it was tempting to think that I'd already got it down to only 90%, the truth was that it still had almost 90% left. If I was serious about defeating the creature, I had to abandon the evasion-centric plan that we'd been following and risk the danger to challenge it in close combat. The Magnatherium would only charge when there was enough distance between it and the target, but I knew from the experience that it would breathe fire at point blank. I wasn't guaranteed successful dash through its legs each time. Neither was there any guarantee that I'd find a spring nearby. Based on how much heat the water had absorbed on those attempts, I couldn't just stick close to one particular well and reuse it. Asuna read my mind. There's a series of 4 springs in close succession over there. If you use them in order, you might be able to keep evading the fire. Great. Her powers of observation and decision-making were second to none, as usual. But I had my doubts. I asked the fencer for something that was weighing on my mind. Asuna, you're not just being stubborn, right? Huh? I glanced over at her and elaborated. The old man wants to build the best boat possible, so you want him to get him the best materials you can. That's what you said. But if that sentiment is something that the game is making you say, because you don't want to let it win, to make you feel like you're not good enough, then I don't think we should fight the bear in victory in this game. In this world, isn't completing quests with the best result, it's to survive, she finished in a faint whisper. Don't worry, I'm not focusing on the results. The biggest motive for doing all this is I think you and I can beat that bear. My only response was to smile awkwardly. Then promise me one thing. Next time I tell you to run, do so instantly, without argument. All right, she responded instantly. I was ready. We'd observed the deadly Magnatherium for over 20 minutes, and its patterns weren't really that complex. We could win as long as we kept our concentration strong. When it comes to close combat, I'll deflect its attacks with sword skills, and you can switch in for a single attack. Don't push your luck, even if you think you can get another sword skill in. Got it. So, shall we? We readied ourselves at the same time that the bear recovered from its prone position. I stared down at the giant beast as it lumbered closer on all fours, shutting all unnecessary thoughts out of my head. I squeezed my trusty sword and launched off the soggy ground toward the concentrated spring area that Asuna had found.